What if I told you America's most humiliating military defeat wasn't blamed on poor leadership, but on a ghost? Not a literal ghost, but something even more powerful, a phantom genius, conjured from the nation's desperation. When Custer and his men were wiped out at Little Bighorn, the country couldn't bear the truth. So instead of facing the recklessness of their golden-haired hero, they reached for fiction, a shadowy mastermind, a mysterious figure leading the Sioux with brilliance so eerie it could only have come from the mind of a betrayed white officer, or so the story went. It was a tale too perfect to be true. Because it wasn't. The Battle of the Little Bighorn wasn't just another skirmish in 1876. America's centennial year. It was a national humiliation. A blow so deep that its reverberations spanned generations. This wasn't a minor frontier clash. It was the orchestrated destruction of one of the U.S. Army's elite cavalry regiments, led by a man who was once a national star. And the story of how it all happened didn't begin with a bugle's call to arms, but with a broken promise, the lure of gold, and a government treaty it never intended to honor. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 was one of those grand documents governments loved to sign. It guaranteed the Lakota Sioux full ownership of the sacred Black Hills, Pahasapa, forever. The language was absolute, promising the land would remain theirs, as long as grass shall grow and rivers shall run. A beautiful promise, but in the ruthless machinery of westward expansion, such promises were temporary obstacles at best. The treaty lasted only long enough for the ink to dry. In 1874, a military expedition led by none other than Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer confirmed rumors of gold in the heart of the Black Hills. That declaration was like a starting gun. Thousands of white prospectors flooded the sacred lands illegally, ripping them apart in search of wealth. The grass still grew, but a new, more powerful currency, gold, began to flow. Facing a crisis of its own making, the U.S. government chose aggression. Rather than remove the invading miners, it decided to remove the land's legal owners. On December 18, 1875, it issued a ruthless ultimatum. All Sioux and Cheyenne not already living on designated reservations had to return by January 31, 1876, or be declared hostile. This demand was impossible, forcing thousands of people, including women, children, and the elderly, to cross hundreds of frozen miles across the northern plains in midwinter wasn't an administrative order. It was a declaration of war disguised as paperwork. The government created its own justification for violence, manufacturing an enemy by issuing an order it knew could not be followed. On one side stood the 7th Cavalry under Custer's command, about 650 men. It was not a uniform force. Among them were Irish and German immigrants, Civil War veterans from both North and South, and young men in search of adventure. Their official mission was to force so-called hostile bands back onto reservations. On the other side was a power the U.S. military had consistently underestimated, a massive alliance of Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho, one of the largest gatherings of native forces on the plains. With around 7,000 people and 1,500 to 2,500 warriors ready to fight. They were led by legendary figures, Sitting Bull, the great spiritual leader of the Hunkpapa Lakota who had visions of a great victory, Crazy Horse, the fearless and brilliant strategist of the Oglala Lakota, and Gall, the fierce tactician of the Hunkpapa. They were not the hostile savages the U.S. government portrayed. They were a nation fighting for their homeland. When a story is too ugly, too shameful, or too confusing, people often rewrite it. The annihilation of Custer's entire command at Little Bighorn was a shock the nation couldn't easily explain. How could a Civil War hero, a national icon, be utterly wiped out by a force they had dismissed? That gap in understanding quickly became fertile ground for fiction to grow. Just months after the battle, writer Frederick Whitaker released a hastily written biography, A Complete Life of General George A. Custer. A dime novelist by trade, Whitaker was more skilled at drama than truth. Faced with the inconvenient question, how do you explain this defeat? Whitaker didn't blame Custer's tactics or native leadership. Instead, he invented a villain, Bison, a dark-skinned man, possibly of mixed race, once a cadet at West Point. After being expelled for clashing with superiors, he supposedly abandoned white society, joined the Cheyenne, married a chief's daughter, and became their supreme military commander. Whitaker claimed Bison masterminded the complex plan that led to Custer's annihilation, a tragic genius turning Western knowledge against its creators. A gripping tale full of mystery, betrayal, and a worthy enemy, but it was pure fiction. There is no historical evidence that Bison ever existed, no military records, no oral traditions from the Lakota or Cheyenne. The idea of Bison made the U.S. defeat easier to swallow. Losing to a West Point-trained mastermind sounded more dignified than losing to wild warriors. But this narrative was drenched in racial prejudice. It assumed Native people couldn't conceive of a successful military plan without white guidance. It was also a clever commercial strategy, transforming a chaotic battle into an epic showdown between two geniuses, Custer, the hero, and Bison, the villain, and it sold books. While Whitaker fabricated a fictional enemy, a wave of opportunists began fabricating themselves. The complete destruction of Custer's 210-man immediate command created a storytelling vacuum. Being the sole survivor could turn anyone into a legend. Earning free drinks in any saloon. Dozens claimed to be the one man who escaped. One of the most well-known tales came from a man named Frank F., who appeared years after the battle. He said he served in Custer's Company C and in the chaos. His horse was shot and bolted, carrying him uncontrollably away from the fight. Wounded and delirious, he claimed to have wandered the plains for days before being rescued by fur traders. Finkeley's story was convincing enough to persuade his wife and neighbors, and his case has been debated for over a century. However, his name appears on none of the official rosters of the 7th Cavalry. Supporters argue he likely enlisted under a false name, a common practice at the time. But professional historians, most notably Robert M. Utley, have systematically dismantled his claim, pointing out numerous inconsistencies and a complete lack of verifiable proof. Finkeley's tale remains a masterclass in historical gaslighting, a story so well told that it almost feels true. Others were even more brazen. A man named Raymond Gardner, performing under the stage name Arizona Bill, brazenly wove a survival tale into his Wild West shows purely for publicity. Before cheering crowds, he claimed he had served as one of Custer's scouts and was sent away with a message just before the final assault, thus narrowly escaping his comrade's tragic fate. It was complete fabrication, no evidence whatsoever, designed solely to boost the authenticity of his act and sell more tickets. He was an entertainer, not a soldier, and his story was just another part of the show. Amid all these fake survivors, the only officially recognized survivor from the 5 companies wiped out with Custer was not a human at all but a horse. Comanche, the mount of Captain Miles Keogh, was found on the battlefield 2 days after the fight, seriously wounded. Yet still alive, the army nursed the horse back to health, and it became a living symbol of the disaster. Comanche was granted an honorary retirement, exempt from duty, and declared the regiment's official mascot. It became a celebrity in its own right, a poignant, solitary reminder of the men who did not return. However, the entire sole survivor narrative is rooted in a widespread misunderstanding. The myth of the last stand led many to believe the entire 7th Cavalry was wiped out that day. But that is absolutely false. While Custer and the 5 companies under his direct command were indeed annihilated, the other half of the regiment under Major Marcus Reno and Captain Frederick Benteen lived on. Hundreds of soldiers fought their own desperate battle just a few miles away, holding a defensive position on a hilltop for nearly 2 days until reinforcements arrived. In fact, hundreds of men from the 7th Cavalry survived the Battle of Little Bighorn. But their story was one of tense siege and dire circumstances, not the romanticized tragedy of a final stand. History, and especially Hollywood, prefers the simplicity of total annihilation. So the complex truth of Reno and Benteen's survival is often pushed aside in favor of the more dramatic myths born from the last moments of Custer. In the immediate aftermath of Little Bighorn, America was in shock. A nation celebrating its centennial could not stomach the truth that it had suffered a catastrophic military failure at the hands of people it considered savage. They needed a hero. They needed a story that could reframe the shocking defeat as a noble tragedy. Thus was born the legend of Custer's Last Stand, and at its core lay an even more powerful falsehood: the tale of Custer's final bullet. This legend spread rapidly through newspapers and word of mouth. The image proved too compelling to resist. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, the golden-haired celebrity general, standing among his fallen men, with no hope of rescue. Rather than be captured and endure imagined torture, he raises his revolver to his temple and ends his own life with his final shot. That image of defiant suicide became the ultimate symbol of American stoicism, painted, sculpted, emblazoned in dime novels, and finally etched into national memory by Hollywood. It was a perfect ending for a country unable to accept reality. It preserved Custer's pride and cast his death as a final, self-controlled act of heroism. The only problem: it almost certainly never happened. The story is pure fiction, a heroic myth undone by cold, hard evidence. The truth lies not in legend, but in the testimony of those who were really there and, most crucially, in Custer's own body. The first professional examination of his remains was conducted by Dr. Henry Porter, a surgeon who survived the battle with Reno's command. His findings were clear and completely demolished the suicide myth. Custer suffered 2 fatal gunshot wounds, one to his left chest, just below the heart, and the other to his left temple. Either would have been instantly fatal. But the temple wound, the supposed proof of suicide, lacked a critical detail: powder burns. A gun fired at close range against the skin leaves a characteristic soot rain. Custer's body had none. That single forensic fact makes the suicide theory nearly impossible. He was shot from a distance, not by his own hand. This evidence was confirmed by the men who buried him. Soldiers from Reno and Benteen's commands, tasked with the grim job of burying their comrades 2 days later, examined Custer's corpse up close. Though their narratives vary slightly on minor details, not one ever mentioned any sign of suicide. They saw 2 wounds and recognized them for what they were: the result of combat. Had there been any indication their commander had killed himself, it would have been the most talked about aspect of the burial. Instead, there is a profound silence across all accounts. Perhaps the most compelling evidence against the myth comes from the victors themselves. The Lakota and Cheyenne warriors who defeated the 7th Cavalry were keen observers of battlefield conduct. To them, bravery was the highest virtue and suicide its polar opposite. It was regarded as the ultimate dishonor. Had Custer truly killed himself, they would not have framed it as noble, it would have been seen as disgraceful. Warriors like White Bull and Two Moons provided detailed accounts of the battle's final moments. While their stories vary, they all agree on one point: Custer fought until he was felled by his enemies. The idea that they'd omit or invent his self-inflicted death makes no sense. Defeating a brave warrior is an honor. Finding a self-killed foe earns scorn, not respect. Modern historians are nearly unanimous: Custer died fighting. The suicide myth was manufactured afterward, a comforting lie to soften the sting of a humiliating, comprehensive defeat. The myths surrounding Little Bighorn didn't appear out of nowhere. They were the analgesics a shocked nation craved. 19th-century America thrived on simplistic narratives of heroes and villains, of righteous progress over a savage frontier. Custer's defeat was a program error in that propaganda machine, a spectacular failure that needed explaining. These fictional stories, from phantom geniuses to fake survivors, offered a more digestible truth. They were born of deep-seated racial biases that could not fathom Native American warriors outsmarting the U.S. Army. It was far easier to credit victory to a rogue, Western-trained white leader than to acknowledge the strategic brilliance of people like Crazy Horse and Gall. Once conceived, these myths were amplified by a growing mass media apparatus, from dime novels to Hollywood epics, that cemented the lies into the foundation of American pop culture. Tearing away these layers of myth is more than a historical exercise, it's a corrective act. Debunking them allows us to see the event clearly. It restores complexity to figures like Custer, not a martyr, not a monster, nor a saint, but a reckless, ambitious commander. More importantly, it restores proper credit to the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho forces for their superior strategy and fierce determination to defend their families and homeland. The story of Little Bighorn serves as a perfect case study in how history isn't just what happened but who gets to tell the story. By stripping away these myths, we learn how narratives can be deliberately shaped for political and cultural ends, a lesson as vital today as ever. It reminds us to look with critical eyes, question official stories, and seek out truths buried beneath layers of legend. Custer's final bullet wasn't meant for himself, it was merely the last shot fired in a battle he had already lost. The myth of a heroic death was simply a better story than the truth of a catastrophic failure. The fighting at Little Bighorn concluded in hours, but the battle over its legacy rages on.